Okay, so thanks very much for the invite to come and talk to you today. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself and how we ended up studying lone actor terrorism and some of the things that we found over the last few years. So when I was a budding PhD student, just starting off on my projects, I really wanted to study Northern Ireland, about why people joined these violent groups, how they sustained commitment, and ultimately why they left these groups. And I was told by my supervisors, do not study Northern Ireland, you will never ever get a job. So I let it go for a period of time and ended up studying almost the opposite type of terrorist group, one that sort of employs suicide bombers. So we did that for a few years, and then I ended up at the International Centre for the Study of Terrorism at Pennsylvania State University, working for a leading expert in the psychology of terrorism, a guy called John Horgan, who's from Kerry. And don't hold that against him, he's a brilliant academic. So we ended up studying, on my first day he sort of twigged my accent and said, let's do a study on the IRA. So we ended up studying IRA bomb makers and bomb making techniques that these guys employed and how they trained other bomb makers for a couple of years. And in amidst that study, we started doing a survey of police and intelligence and security agencies about where they really felt that there was a gap in the existing literature, where they felt that, areas that academics had overlooked up until this point. And the topic that kept on coming up time and time again was this issue of lone wolf, lone actor terrorism. So this was back in early 2011. And at the time we were thinking, okay, let's do a really short, sharp study, let's do a one-year study, and we'll be in and out, and we'll nail that kind of aspect of research and then move back to studying Northern Ireland and provisional IRA and loyalist groups and all this type of thing. After about 2 months, just as the project was starting up, Anders Breivik stepped out of his door and engaged in a large-scale bombing attack and a shooting attack on an island in Utoya in Norway, killing over 70 people in one day. And that really changed our perception of the nature of this threat. While we had been looking at it as a sort of low probability, low impact type of attack, he very much brought it home, and very much something that only really happens in the United States. He brought it home as something that is likely in Europe and is also, when it does occur, has the opportunity to be high impact in terms of the number of fatalities, in terms of its societal impact. And that's only been brought home in more salience in recent weeks with the attack in Nice and what we saw in Orlando and Dallas and in other places. This kind of thing that we call lone actor terrorism, lone wolf terrorism, is undoubtedly on the rise in terms of numbers. When we did this initial study in 2011, it was funded by the Department of Homeland Security. And when we looked at the number of lone actor plots and lone wolf attacks year on year from 1990 up until 2011, it was very much stable year on year. The number of actors we'd see, it was like 6 or 7 plots a year. It's very sort of low, minimal stuff. In the years since then, we're looking at probably between 15 and 18 every single year. So not only is there more of them, but they're also getting better at killing people, as again we saw all too tragically in Nice. So again, the first study was funded by the Department of Homeland Security, and then later versions of it was funded by the European Union in a couple of different iterations. We've also been funded by US Department of Justice, the Greater Manchester Police, where we have an ongoing collaboration with. And I'm going to sort of just very quickly go through some of our main findings. So we've looked at approximately 160 cases now, using both open sources, so court records, newspaper reporting about these individuals, where possible, interview transcripts, police transcripts. And we've also looked at closed source intelligence on about 50 UK-based plots. That's the work we've done with the Greater Manchester Police. So for those of you who are fans of Criminal Minds, I'm sorry to disappoint you, there is no profile of a lone actor terrorist. They range in age. We've seen 16-year-olds, we've seen 65-year-olds. We've seen PhD graduates, we've seen guys who dropped out of high school. We've seen people that are long-term married and happy to people that are sort of single right the way through out their life. You name that sort of socio-demographic indicator, we've seen at least a couple of examples of that type of person. What I would say is, though, most of these individuals are suffering from a great deal of number of risk factors at the time that they adopted the ideology. So not everything is going right in their lives at the time they adopt the ideology. And often the ideology gives them a sort of a sense of black and white thinking, whereas things were spiralling out of control for them. They find the ideology and it gives them very sort of black and white kind of thinking. One of the things but we never really expected to find a profile, and even if we did, it's kind of operationally it's quite useless because it over-predicts who becomes a terrorist. One of the things that really did surprise us in our initial study was the degree to which other people generally knew something was up. So in 60% of our cases, the individual told somebody within their sort of pre-existing network, I'm going to bomb that site on Tuesday, or I'm going to do a shooting over there on Saturday. So generally, they do leak really specific bits of information. When we were doing this survey of policing and intelligence agencies, we were asking, well, why are you worried about this threat of lone actors? And they said, well, these guys pose a very specific threat that we're not used to. We're very good at getting a sense of who is talking to who and what the nature of that communication is. So if it's a number of people, 4, 6, or 8 individuals engaging in an attack, we are more likely to be able to sort of get a sense of what they're doing. Whereas if it's one person radicalising by himself, choosing a target by himself, and conducting the attack by himself, the opportunities for intervention are much less. But parallel to that, in our study, we found that generally somebody knows something. And it's a very soft piece of intelligence that intelligence agencies are really relying upon now to interdict these guys ahead of time. So, for example, when we saw the Charlie Hebdo attacks a couple of years ago in France, that was 2 individuals, 2 brothers. The neighbour had grown concerned about their behaviour. He broke into the house to have a look around, found a cache of weapons. One of the brothers returned home, threatened him not to say anything, and he didn't say anything and went back home, didn't report it. Now, these guys were on the intelligence agency's radar, but the problem is there's hundreds of individuals on their radar, and they can't keep an eye on everybody 24 hours a day. It's supposed to take 20 people to follow one individual around the clock 24 hours. So multiply that by hundreds of individuals of interest. That's why people slip through the net. Just simply, the caseload is too big, and the manpower needed to watch everybody is also too big. But we've also had cases where the individual was told something or witnessed something in their environment and said it to the intelligence agencies, I have a concern here, and it led to a disruption. Brustholm Ziamani is a perfect example of that. A couple of years ago in London, I think it was last year, the year before, he was sentenced to prison for plotting to engage in a copycat attack of what happened in Woolwich a couple of summers ago, where Lee Rigby was murdered, where a couple of guys tried to decapitate him. Brustholm Ziamani told his girlfriend, next week I'm going to murder a soldier on the streets of London, and I'm going to put it up on a social media site. And luckily she raised an eyebrow, thought that this is very concerning, and told the police, and he ended up being disrupted. So it's not an impossible thing to fight against, but we're really reliant on these soft pieces of intelligence, individuals in the community spotting that and reporting it, and then when it lands on an intelligence analyst's desk, that they make the right kind of risk assessment decision. So often there are these risk factors coupled with they are vocalising their intent, because many of them don't want to be alone when they engage in the attack. One of the other things that sort of surprised us at the time, but doesn't really worry us too much now when we see it, is that our lone actors were significantly more likely to have an experience or a history of mental health problems compared to group-based terrorists. So around about 40% of our sample of lone actor terrorists have had a mental health diagnosis in their build-up. When we compare that to about 25% of the wider population, the wider society will have a mental health diagnosis at some point in their life, but the types of diagnoses that these guys are getting are very different. So significantly higher rates of delusional disorders, significantly higher rates of schizophrenia. Now often, like you'll see in the aftermath of the Nice attack, they'll say, well, there's a mental health problem there, that's what caused it. Our research doesn't really say that. Our research says that's just one of multiple things that are ongoing at that time. That's just one maybe concerning indicator, but there's often, breakdown of family relationships, loss of a job, they've built a grievance against a person, place, or kind of fabric of society. It's all these things that are bubbling away together that kind of crystallise at the same point in time. So in the immediate aftermath of an attack, there'll often be a rush to sort of push it to one silver bullet explanation. So, he was mentally ill, or, he was online radicalised, or, in the case of Orlando, he was actually a homosexual. Well, sometimes it could be all of these factors, and we need to sort of embrace the complexity of individual motivation if we're going to be able to understand how to prevent it or interdict it. One of the other things that we found was that generally they say they're doing it for an ideology, but often there's a lot of other things going on there. So once you scrape below the surface of the ideology, often there's a number of personal reasons why they're doing it. There's personal factors. Sometimes you get guys that are just violent individuals, historically violent guys, who then, under the banner of ISIS or banner of another group, find an excuse to be even more violent against a sub-part of the population. Many of them are pretty illiterate when it comes to what the group actually understands. ISIS, for many, is just the cool brand right now. When ISIS dies away, there'll be another radical Islamic group engaging in violence, some other part of the country, some other part of the world, and they'll say, that's why I'm doing it. I think often we're looking too much at why they're doing it. I don't think if you sat down and had an interview with these people, they could actually, in an eloquent way, tell you really why they're doing it. Because often it's a mixture of ideological reasons, personal risk factors, and so on. And often in the attack itself, you see where those personal grievances play out. We had a case recently in the last few years in London, Roshanara Chowdhury, who stabbed Labour Party MP Stephen Timms, almost killed him in his constituency office. Now, she was a girl that was a first-class honours student at King's College London, London's third best university after UCL and Imperial. She was a first-class student. She was well on her way to a first-class degree. And she went to her local MP and asked for an extension of her welfare loan to see her into her master's degree so that she could gain the qualification that she needed to be in the profession she wanted. And he said, no, there's no regulation in place to give loans to master's students. So she went home that night and thought, what's the point in going through all this stress of getting a first-class honours degree? I'm just going to quit now. So she quits. All of a sudden, she's got lots of free time in her day that she used to spend in front of books, and she's hanging out online. She stumbles across some extremist forums, and she falls for the message. And she falls for one particular radical cleric who says that there's a role for women as fighters. It's not just about being wives of fighters and facilitators. There's a role as you as a fighter. So she says, okay, I've fallen for this. I'm going to do an attack on behalf of Al-Qaeda. I think I'm going to attack an MP. And she chose the MP that said no to her welfare payments, right? So time and time again, we see this mixture of people that have, or parts of society that have personally really annoyed them, and then they wrap that personal grievance up in a wider political cause to give it kind of greater traction. Because a lot of these guys, they want to be known afterwards. They want to be famous. They want their faces out there. And that's often why, historically, we've seen, like when we finished that first study in 2011, most lone actor attacks where, they were looking to do big bombings, they were looking to do mass shootings, they were looking for stuff that was technologically quite difficult in terms of getting your hands on the weaponry, getting your hands on things. And all of those activities and behaviours may raise red flags. Because that's what they, because that's what they felt. If I do something that's really big and really, I'm going to be remembered, and my face is always going to be remembered. And that's what they wanted. So they would often go for a big plan A. They couldn't pull it off, so they'd go plan B, plan C, plan D. Now, much more often, they're going for low-tech, hard-to-detect type of attack as their plan A. Whereas often that was just, they would give up by the time they got to that point. But now they're going for vehicular assaults, stabbings, which is what ISIS, Al-Qaeda, anti-abortion movements, right-wing movements have been saying to potential lone actors for about 25, 30 years. Don't try and do the big things. You're going to get caught. They're going to notice you buying that amount of materials. The security forces are going to notice it. So don't do low-tech, do a stabbing, do these things. But it's only now that people are starting to actually follow that. And you'll often hear in the media and so on that that's because of social media and Instagram, and they do HD videos now, and that's what radicalizes people. That's just people in the media that don't understand how easy it is to run a Twitter account. The ones that actually solved this problem of doing low-tech, hard-to-detect attacks, but an attack that will make you sufficiently famous, was the guys at Woolwich. Both of those guys, Michael Adebowale and Michael Adebolajo, they both ran over Lee Rigby in their car. They both stabbed him, and they both tried to take his head off. Only one of them got in front of the camera and made the big speech with the bloodied hands, while the other guy, who's heavily mentally disordered in the background, is staring at his shoes. The guy in front of the camera with the bloodied hands is seen as a hero in extremist circles. The guy in the background is barely mentioned. The only difference between those two was one got in front of the camera, and that's why he's seen as the hero. So let's not overplay the ideology, because I don't think most of them know what it actually is in the first place. What most of them are looking for is fame, to be remembered. A lot of them have these personal risk factors and personal grievances. And as we see this investigation play out in Nice, we're likely to find these same patterns. Some of our work now is a part of a project called Project Regulus, which has basically written the risk assessment tool for how new intelligence is assessed on the lone actor threat in the UK. And it's been a sort of validated tool to try and, interdict a number of these cases. And we've had a number of successes in the UK. So again, it's about, even with Brexit, the UK should have a role in sort of helping inform these other countries that are having a really tough time with detecting, preventing, disrupting and mitigating against lone actor attacks in the coming years. I think I'm pretty much out of time, so I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.